Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. Teachers' unions, Stop and Shop workers, UAW, have gone on strike, flexing the strength of workers' movements and muscle across the country. Polls now show that a majority of Americans support labor unions and the unionization of workers. And now Bernie Sanders has come out with his platform to support and strengthen unions called the Workplace Democracy Plan, WDP, people are calling it, as it is known in that Sanders world. And it gives workers more power in the class struggle, is what Sanders said. That's what he thinks he needs to do. As we all know, union power has been diminished from the 50s, when 1/3 of all workers were unionized, and unions built the backbone of the middle class in our country. It was diminished by laws like Taft-Hartley and others that made it more difficult to organize, and by changing priorities of union leadership. So with auto workers out and Sanders raising the bar of class struggle, what does the future portend, and what should we be asking? We start today's conversation with Connor Lewis, who's editor of Strike Wave and union activist. And Connor Lewis, welcome to the Real News. Good to have you with us.
No, thanks for having me on, Mark.
So let's start with this. What do you think's afoot here? I mean, clearly we're in a moment where Sanders has come out with this platform, probably the first presidential candidate I can remember to ever come out with this comprehensive, a pro-trade union platform ever that I've seen. And all these strikes taking place, UAW walking out, and maybe even could last even longer. We don't know how long it's going to go. The teachers over the last 2 years, just hitting the streets, other public workers. What do you think's afoot?
Well, I think that one of the things that you're seeing is that you have a shift in generational opinions about labor unions. If you look at some of the polling data, it shows that, millennials, Generation Z, et cetera, folks that are increasingly becoming a majority of the workforce view unions much more positively than the general population. So I think that you have that overall generational shift in how people are viewing labor, but you also have a lot of people that are coming into the workforce in an economy that in a lot of ways still hasn't recovered fully from the recession. Even though the economy is doing well and there are a lot of jobs, those jobs don't necessarily pay the same that, good union jobs in the 1950s, 60s, et cetera, used to pay. And so I think a lot of workers are looking at the economy, understanding that the economy is booming, but they're not feeling that they're getting that money into their pockets. So I think a lot of folks are taking another look at the labor movement and thinking this is something that can, and maybe the only thing that can help us actually address, what we're seeing around us.
So we're going to, in a minute, I want to kind of parse through some of the stuff that Bernie Sanders laid out and his campaign laid out. But before we do that, because it's fairly comprehensive, and some people it doesn't go far enough. Obviously, a lot of people think it goes too far. But when you look at what he's pushing here, talking about a class struggle and pushing for union power and workers' power in America, which is unheard of in many ways from a presidential candidate in the United States. Let's go back a little bit here, 2008, and the Employee Free Choice Act. When that came out in Obama, 2008, they had control of both houses, 60 votes in the Senate. They couldn't get anything through. They couldn't change the labor laws of this country. They could even that minimum amount in that act. So right now you have the Senate in control of Republicans. You have a lot of very strong corporate power inside the House of Representatives as well. So I mean, just the political context of this. What makes them think that this can even happen?
Well, I think that one of the differences that we're seeing now is that there's actually an upsurge of worker activity. There's an upsurge of collective action that you just didn't see even in 2008. And so I think that a lot of people need to keep in mind that those are the kinds of things that are actually going to make these policies happen. It's going to come from below. You saw that in the 1930s with a lot of elements of the New Deal, especially the National Labor Relations Act, which was pushed by a lot of the actual, shop floor organizing activity that was driven by union activists. It really didn't happen when we were talking about the Employee Free Choice Act, but that's the context we're living in now when you have, for example, the UAW workers are out right now. You just had a very large CWA strike in the Southeast. And then, you have the context of all of these teacher walkouts. We're living in the middle of a strike wave that we haven't seen since the 1980s. And so I think that the overall political climate is very, very different because of what we're seeing from workers themselves.
But none of that actually moves or changes unless you elect people, the way our country works at the moment, unless you elect people who actually are pro-union, pro-worker, And that, I mean, that's where this political power seems to have waned, in part because I think, before we jump into Sanders' platform, in part because Taft-Hartley, all the bills that were passed to limit the power of unions, to limit the power of the working class, and add to that the kind of recalcitrant behavior of many union leaders who don't organize anymore. I mean, I'm saying that there's this double-edged sword that's been really destroying union power.
I agree entirely. And, I think that one of the things that we're seeing is, one, we need to start electing progressive Democrats that are going to do more than pay lip service to the labor movement when it comes to election time. You can see this in some of the new Democrats that have been elected to Congress, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and, the squad, as well as, even some more conservative Democrats that really, like Connor Lamb out in Pittsburgh, that, while I don't think he'd call himself a progressive, and I think very few others would, has really put organized labor front and center in both his initial election and, his view of politics. And so I think that what we need is to make sure that we have those politicians that are embedded in the labor movement that actually act in a pro-worker fashion instead of just, give pro-worker statements. And I also think that we need to keep in mind that a lot of what's going to move them is what voters care about. What are the issues of the day? And, I point to the example of Beto O'Rourke, who doesn't even have all that much of a reputation as a pro-labor kind of guy. And in fact, there are a lot of questions about his record on labor.
Yeah.
As one of the few people, presidential candidates, that's actually released a fairly comprehensive, though nowhere near as comprehensive as Bernie Sanders, has released a plan on how to revitalize the labor movement. And so I think that we're seeing that politicians can be pushed. And I think that we need to elect the politicians that are going to respond to that kind of pressure.
So let's go over some things here. There's some issues here with the Sanders proposal I want to, if we have time, really address. But talk to us a bit about the key elements here in terms of what he's attempting to do to give power back in terms of striking and organizing and not being interfered with by the owners of corporations, allowing people to work at McDonald's to either unionize through McDonald's or unionize through all the shops, no matter if they're owned by different peoples. So talk a bit about what's so different about what Bernie is saying here.
I think that what's really impressive about Sanders' plan is that he's really taking a holistic look at what is the problem, what is it going to take to actually rebuild working class power, and to allow unions to fight for the working class in the ways that they did, during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even until you had this kind of employer counteroffensive that really started to gain steam under Ronald Reagan. I think that the big part that, quite frankly, just has never been part of the discussion in the United States, that I think is actually flying a little bit under the radar, is his proposal to end at-will employment and to enact nationwide just cause, which would establish that employers need a justifiable workplace or work performance-related reason to actually terminate an employee. And I think that that's something that most Americans just assume that management has the right to fire them for whatever reason, and it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, the fact that it is that way in the United States is kind of an outlier in the developed world. And so I think that that's a really crucial element of the proposal that's kind of gotten less attention. But aside from that, a couple of different elements, such as, for example, ensuring that unions can actually get a first contract once they've been recognized without the long management delays, the union busting, et cetera, that employers have really perfected over the past 50 years, is really crucial to make sure that once you have a union, that you can get a good first contract and keep it. And so the proposal is actually one that's taken from the Employee Free Choice Act, which allows for independent third-party arbitration if the parties are not are at 90 days and they haven't gotten an agreement yet. And so they can take those things to a third-party arbitrator and mediate them. The other thing that is really, really crucial, of course, is also another element of the Employee Free Choice Act, which is card check. What happens right now is that there's what's called a two-tier or two-stage election for union representation. You have to get what's called a showing of interest, which is 30% of the proposed employees that would be part of the union have to indicate that they would like one. Then they file for an election, and then that gives a window where employers can essentially roll out a whole suite of union-busting tactics, usually through very high-priced law firms like Ballard Spahr or Proskauer Rose, to try to defeat the union. And then later, you have the second election, and then you need 50% plus one of the people to vote. What card check would do is simply say that all you need is a majority of the proposed unit to sign cards saying, we want representation. And then one of the last things that's really, really crucial is that there's basically a way for employers to take a look, or to basically employers can bring in union busters and force employees as a condition of their continued employment to attend a meeting, scaring them into what's going to happen if they unionize. So they'll bring in an attorney from outside, or in the case of the Chattanooga campaign for UAW representation at Volkswagen, they actually brought in the governor of Tennessee and made everyone attend, and then scared them that if they vote for a union, they're going to lose their jobs. And so one of the really, really crucial parts of the Sanders plan is that employers can't do that. They can't require that an employee attend those meetings as a condition of their employment, which allows employees to decide, I've got better things to do than to go to a meeting where I'm going to be told that I'm going to lose my job if I unionize. So those are some of the really crucial elements of the plan that I think are really important to revitalizing the labor movement. There's a lot of elements to it, even beside that, that are each in of themselves would be a substantial benefit to the working class and organized labor.
I mean, one of the things here, in the short time we have, there's so much in this plan, and we take a lot of time to kind of dissect it piece by piece. But when you have things like Taft-Hartley and major parts of the National Labor Relations Act, they really have gotten in the way of unions being able to organize in the workplace, stopping them from doing industry-wide organizing, stopping them from striking in order to organize, and not allowing employers just to come in and use the police as ways to bring scabs and workers into the plant, which is, and these kind of issues. So I mean, there's a lot here that the resistance is going to be massive from industry to allow any of these things to take place. And so, I mean, go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so ambitious about it, and it reminds me in a lot of ways of Roosevelt, and in a lot of ways he led this kind of fight against industry's allies in Congress, and we haven't really seen a president or any kind of presidential candidate since FDR talk about that kind of fight. There are a lot of elements to this. It's going to immeasurably strengthen organized labor, and there's going to be massive industry pushback. I mean, the fight against the Employee Free Choice Act was rough enough. It's going to be 1,000 times worse for this. And I think that that's something that really speaks to the fact that there needs to actually be a movement behind this, and there needs to be a movement to elect politicians that are actually going to, when pushed by industry, side with workers over industry. So it's not going to be something that Sanders can do alone. It's something that's going to require the votes in Congress to make this happen. And it's going to require people in the streets making the sustained pressure to force Congress into acting.
Well, I wish we had a great deal more time, Connor. There's so much here to talk about. I look forward to having you back to really go through this and maybe do a series with you and some others to kind of really dive into what it takes to bring union power to our country that built this middle class, and see where it takes us, given how we've become. The unions have also been, the problem has been also this divisiveness we have around race and playing the white working class against workers of color in this country. That's a huge part of what's dividing this union movement. So there's a lot here to kind of wrestle with. And in your view, I take it, you think that does the Sanders plan address any of that?
I think that it does, yes, because one of the things that really has been one of the key parts of removing union rights from, for example, workers of color is the original National Labor Relations Act said that domestic workers and farm workers, both of whom were predominantly at the time workers of color and still are workers of color, didn't have organizing rights. They couldn't access a union. And so I think that one of the things that the Sanders Plan does is it closes that loophole. And I think it really addresses some of the ways in which, unfortunately, labor law has been used to actually divide workers against one another.
Well, Connor Lewis has been great. Editor of Strike Wave, and we'll link to that on this conversation. You should definitely check out the work he's been doing. Connor, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Mark.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Let us know what you think. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.